Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting you to this edition of Polaris-Live, programming on the U.S. China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. We are coming to you live, so you may want to ask questions. Use the block on the right-hand side of the screen. My guests today are Dr. Raustiala, Promise Institute Distinguished Professor of Comparative and International Law at UCLA, Director of the Burkle Center, and Mr. Chris Fenton, Advisor to companies, investors, and Congress on how best to navigate and optimize America's complicated relationship with China. Both were participants at a conference last week at UCLA. It was the first joint conference between the Foreign Policy Association and the Burkle Center. The conference was on how to improve relations between U.S. and China. So welcome, please, Dr. Raustiala and Mr. Fenton.
Thanks for having me.
How are you today?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Listen, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to do that. We had this conference last week. It brought together experts from around the country and, in fact, from Canada to suggest ways in which U.S.-China relationships could be improved. We were able to reach broad, actionable consensus on recommendations to improve these relations, something that seems to be missing in the headlines. Why do you think this happened? Was there something about the conference? Let's start with you, Dr. Raustiala, and then Chris Fenton.
So something about the conference that allowed us to come up with some conclusions and suggestions that seem to elude the outside world. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we had a very good group of people, a diverse array of opinions, but also thoughtful. And I think part of the problem, and Chris is probably even more familiar with this than I am, is I think in Washington, there's often a kind of groupthink that goes on within the Beltway on so many issues, and a bit of hysteria around China. China is a serious issue, even a serious threat, but it's one of the few bipartisan issues that we see in foreign policy today. So I think sometimes that can make it hard to actually think creatively. So you need to get out of the Beltway at times to come up with ideas.
That's. Do you think Chris? Let me let you address it also.
Look, I think the fact of the matter is the relationship is really important for both countries, but it's been completely politicized. And one side of the aisle versus the other is essentially taking the opposite position when it comes to China in a lot of cases. I think one of the great benefits that former Congressman Mike Gallagher and present Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy brought to the table was this idea of a bipartisan consensus on how to pave the path forward on a bilateral relationship, and one that has a constructiveness to it, one that isn't going to create a Thucydides trap, one that isn't going to create a kinetic conflict between the two countries, but also one that prioritizes national security interests of the United States of America, and also one that pushes the idea of engagement with a communist country that doesn't sacrifice the principles and values that we hold dearly here as Americans. And once it looked like we can actually get a bipartisan consensus on how to approach just various topics, various issues in the relationship, and actually put together implementation of how to execute those on a single issue level, I think it's given me a lot of hope that we can actually come together on more of a macro scope way of moving forward the relationship, and one that actually will benefit my kids who are 17 years old, because they're going to have to deal with this also. And this is something that's going to affect us for generations to come.
Do you think, Chris, continuing on with you, that there is a different feeling for relations with China from the United States on the West Coast than there is on the East. It just struck me as I was thinking about questions to ask, because we were in Los Angeles, obviously, at the wonderful campus of UCLA. What do you think?
I would say it's more of a coastal versus, for a long time, it was really red states and blue states seeing the China relationship in completely different ways. On top of it, I think there is a part of engagement and people's investment in that engagement and whether they see a day-to-day engagement in their own daily lives. So I would argue that even though the West Coast has been typically more, I would say, dovish towards the relationship, which is in a similar fashion to the East Coast. The interaction directly with China tends to hit the West Coast more. So you do have a capitalistic and an emotional engagement that is affecting the way people think about that bilateral relationship and the fact that they are probably trying to protect and preserve the way it was in the status quo in a lot of ways. But also the West Coast has seen the engagement go awry often because of those touch points. So I think there are various individuals that have studied this and are probably a little more hawkish than, say, parts of the other states in the country. So it's a little bit of a push and pull, but I would say, yes, there are differentiations between different regions of America in terms of how we engage with them, with the other side.
And how do you feel about that, Cal? You're in charge of one of the most important centers of international relations that we have in the country. Do you think that there is something, an added ingredient on the West Coast in these discussions that carries a different flavor and outcome?
Yeah, I think Chris made a lot of valid points on that. And, I would add that, well, first of all, in general, I think California often has a slightly different take on many foreign policy issues, or really many policy issues generally, not just foreign policy.
Right.
California is often at the vanguard of whatever the issue might be in the United States. It often starts here, not always, but many times. I think with regard to China, first of all, we have a very large Asian and Asian American population in China compared to the rest of the country. It's not like there aren't, let's say, Chinatowns in other parts of the country, but you can go out to the San Gabriel Valley east of Los Angeles and drive down freeways where all of the billboards are in Mandarin. And it's as if you're in a Chinese, suburb. And so there's a way in which I think a lot of Californians are familiar with China, with Asia generally, have spent time there, have personal connections, they see the effects of it. We're much more acclimated to what I expect the rest of the country to experience in the coming decades. Now, whether that plays out on a dove-hawk scale can be hard to measure. I think Chris is right that sometimes that can make you more hawkish because you've seen, let's say if you're in the business sector, you've experienced some of the risks of close engagement with China in particular. On the other hand, I think generally the average voter who doesn't do that is probably somewhat more comfortable with an Asian future, an Asian 21st century than someone in Ohio. So I think those things, it's very hard to tease those out. And I'm sure some people are doing, good work on surveys. I know Carnegie Endowment, for example, is doing a major survey here in California that might get at some of this. But just anecdotally, I do think there's a different mindset. And of course, we're very far from Washington and from New York. So that just gives us our own take. So yeah, I've always been a believer. I've lived in California for 30 years, really, over the course of 3 decades. And it's definitely got a different feeling than, say, DC or New York, both of which I spent a lot of time in.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, that there's a misnomer that Chinese Americans or Chinese that are living here in the United States all think the same way about China. You have to realize that a lot of them are Taiwanese. And they have particular feelings towards China that is very different than a mainland Chinese national that has come here to live. On top of it, you have Chinese Americans who maybe escaped the PRC during the Cultural Revolution or for other reasons and look not so fondly back at their original homeland. And then you also have very pro-China Chinese Americans too. So there's a bunch of different layers to look at. It's not all one.
Sure. I should remind our viewers who are not in the conference that part of what we did intentionally is not include security, military issues in this conference, so that we would not generate more friction than we needed to, and lay the odds towards reaching some kind of consensus. And what we came out with, as both of you know, is a very heavy emphasis on cultural, people-to-people student exchanges to kick off this improving avalanche, if I may call it that. But yesterday the Christian Science Monitor reported that only 700 American students are presently studying in China. I mean, I was really surprised by that number, and I wanted to ask you, Mr. Fenton. Let me start with Dr. Raustiala, and then with you, Mr. Fenton. What do you think? Does that surprise you? Only 700 students?
Yeah, that does surprise me. That seems very low. I know that numbers have gone down. I've heard that from many sources, including here at UCLA. That numbers have gone way down in both directions, but particularly with regard to Americans there. And of course, it's part of a larger trend of the number of American expats working in Shanghai or Beijing or Hong Kong way down. So all of that's of a piece. All that said, 700 is a shocking number, and I think a real problem. One of the ways that we discussed in our meeting, for sure, but I think many people would agree that it's important to have a kind of people-to-people contact through students in both directions to understand both places, because we are going to be intertwined, short of a catastrophic war, which no one wants, at least I hope no one wants. We are going to be dealing with China and China dealing with us in all sorts of fronts for decades, and understanding the culture, the politics, the economics of each place is really important, and student exchange is one of the best ways to do that. So I'm not happy to hear that figure, if that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, and in fact, I'm glad Cal brought that up about expats, but I would add that I'm from the Hollywood business, right? And some of the scariest horror movies that have ever been made by the entertainment business are ones that you never see the monster in, right? I think of the Blair Witch Project, if anybody remembers that one. You never saw the monster there, but it was an extremely scary movie. I think the same can be said in terms of non-allied nations that are constantly mysterious to us because we haven't touched and felt and interacted with those other countries. So it is really important that we are interacting. The student population probably follows the same correlation as I see in the world of capitalism in terms of getting expats on the ground over there. A lot of that had to do with the pandemic, the draconian lockdowns that a lot of expats and students don't want to be a part of, that can happen just on a whim. On top of it, it's simple practical reasons. I saw, I guess, once the Washington, D.C. route to China, the nonstop on Air China opened up, I saw coach tickets, I think, were $28,000, and business class tickets were $70,000.
Wow.
The amount of flights going back and forth is a fraction of what it used to be. So even getting there is difficult. So it's a real problem. It's something that even as a trustee at the U.S. Asian Institute, we haven't had any in-person congressional delegation trips since late 2019. And that is important. In fact, Congressman Mike Gallagher, or former Congressman Mike Gallagher, had never been to China before. And that was one of the big things that I really wanted to get him to do before he left. And he obviously got to Taiwan, but never got to the mainland.
Were there any surprises for you, Cal, and you, Chris, at this conference? One of the things I was surprised at, I forget who asked the question to the group, that do you think President Xi Jinping is a dictator? And, that's the way he's often portrayed in the media. And there were some people who obviously thought that, but but a large number didn't seem to. I mean, they said he's authoritarian, he can get more done by waving his hand than President Biden can, but that a dictator doesn't seem to be the proper word to apply to him. So may I ask you, Cal, and then you, Chris, did that surprise you? Was there anything else at the conference that surprised you?
I didn't find that, I guess, all that surprising, in part because there were a number of political scientists there. And within political science, there's been, many debates over authoritarianism and dictatorship and how to define them. And, ideas about, even in an authoritarian regime, there's a kind of selectorate that makes the decisions. And I think we know in reality, the vision of someone with total autocratic control, maybe a Stalin type situation or Mao at his heyday, is actually pretty rare. And so she is extremely powerful. There's no question about that. But he is operating in a system, number one, that was designed for decades to ensure that there wasn't a Mao type leader. Now he's the closest. He's consolidated power on a scale no one's done since Mao, but it was designed expressly to stop that. And then secondly, China is massive, and you've got all of these provinces with their own governments and then cities beneath them and so forth. It's a huge, huge place. So the idea that one person can just kind of wave their hand and make anything happen, I think is unrealistic. So in that sense, if that's the definition of a dictator, yeah, he's not. On the other hand, he's enormously powerful. He's clearly consolidated power to a degree, again, that we haven't seen in many, many years. And he's modified the Chinese constitution. He's elevated his thought to a kind of sanctified level. So there are very ominous signs about his level of control. So I think labels maybe we could debate, but there's no question that he is very strong and has the ability to push through a lot in a way that we haven't seen for a long time.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Cal said. I mean, a lot of it is just purely semantics, and a lot of it tends to be politicized semantics. Whatever the definition people have in terms of dictator, I mean, he's proven that he is in charge. He has actually downsized his standing committee to pretty much be only his allies. He's purged a lot of the people that have dissented with his opinion. The NPC has lost a lot of power. It's just a rubber stamp entity. So pretty much anything he wants to do, he can get done. And just in terms of semantics, I have found that is really important to try to get people on the same page when it comes to talking about China in order to implement any sort of smart, rational, constructive policy towards it. So I've often argued that I don't even like the term CCP or the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, I would rather it just be Beijing that we're talking about, right? And when people have an issue with the United States from some other country, they usually have a problem with Washington. When we have a problem with China, we have a problem with Beijing. In terms of things like Asian hate or being anti-Asian because you're tough on China, I think is another big misnomer and issue, because you're not being tough on Asians. You're not being tough on people that live in Taiwan or in the Philippines or in Southeast Asia when you're tough on Beijing. You're being tough on Beijing because you realize in the best interests of the United States and our allies, there are certain policies, regulatory reform, certain things that we need to incorporate that are going to protect our interests, both as national security interests of Americans, but also in the interests of allies around the world. So the whole terminology that we use around the China relationship is one that we need to depoliticize, and we need to stop getting stuck on, is that the right term or is that the right labeling? We need to actually just get constructive and practical and move things forward in a positive way.
So what I want to ask you, Dr. Raustiala, is California, being California with such a huge Asian population, I would think that there are far fewer instances of ethnic violence or thinking or thought. Would I be correct in thinking that?
I mean, I wish that were true. I guess I don't know whether per capita California has had more anti-Asian or other kind of racially charged crimes or assaults or something like that. We've certainly had a lot more than there should be. But, in a sense, that illustrates what a diverse place California is.
Yes.
And just to go back to our conversation earlier, one of the things about California, certainly about Los Angeles, is, and Chris was just alluding to this, is we have huge representation from all of Asia. We are the biggest Korean city, I believe, outside of Seoul. We have certainly the largest Koreatown in the world. And so, and of course, Korea has a long history. Koreans have a long history with China, not necessarily a good one. Vietnamese in Orange County, etc. So, not to mention the Taiwanese that Chris brought up. So, because of that, there's a real diversity of views about what kind of a threat China poses, how to deal with China, and that often can make, I think, Californians maybe more hawkish. Just again to refer to our kind of start of this conversation, because many of the Californians, in fact, are either people who grew up in Asia in the shadow of China, or are the descendants of those people who carry that kind of concern historically. But so for your specific question, I guess I don't know. I hope that's not the case, but it certainly could be.
And Chris, you have spent a long time in China. You've done business there. You've met dozens and dozens of people. You've lived there, as I said, for a number of years. What would you say the average Chinese view, if there is such a thing, of Americans is? Is it as hostile as the atmosphere here seems to be? What do you think?
Well, I would argue that the sentiment towards Americans is controlled and dictated by probably the Stanmead Committee and Xi Jinping through the Ministry of Propaganda. So if they want sentiment to be more anti-American, they can start to really control the flow of information and news to essentially trigger that type of behavior from their populace. Remember, the majority of 1.4 billion people don't have access to VPNs. They have access to CCTV channels and Guangzhou channel and Beijing television, et cetera. So whatever is on those and however it's describing the United States of America, that's essentially what the sentiment ends up being. I mean, there's a huge love of the culture that comes from the United States. There's a huge love of the products and services that come from us. And there's a huge curiosity factor in terms of our country. And on top of it, for most of the last 40 years, a lot of people wanted to live here or visit here or be educated here. So there was a really strong fondness for this country. I think it's been tainted by Beijing and Washington's warring over things. And the fact that in order for Xi Jinping to push back on the West, he needs to know that the 1.4 billion people he oversees are supportive of that. Because if he starts to push policy, push aggression towards the West that his people don't support, then he starts to put himself in a precarious situation in terms of controlling his power and his authority there. So information and news is crucial, and that is what gauges the temperature, creates the temperature in terms of the way people look at the United States.
As we were talking, I was just reminded of a conversation I had some years ago with General Wesley Clark, who was our NATO commander once and was in charge of running the war in the Balkans and so on. And we were discussing this idea of the American melting pot. And how various ethnic groups, he reminded me, he said, think about the Hispanic population in America. we have Hispanic officials, but they think about American foreign policy, American interests before they would think of their Hispanic interests. And it was such a heartening conversation. I would take it that both of you would agree that that is indeed the case with our ethnically Chinese population, right? That we can't just lump them all together. They think about American interests before they think of Chinese interests. Would you both agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, Wes Clark is an old friend and was a long fellow here at the Burkle Center. And I, of course, agree with that. And I think many Chinese Americans, whether they were born in China and emigrated here or born here, as is the case with an even larger group, of course, have a wide diversity of views, take their American identity to heart like every other. I'm the child of an immigrant myself, so I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I talked earlier about the different perspectives of the different sort of, divisions in Chinese Americans. And I would say, if you're just talking about Chinese nationals that have come here, say, in the last 20 years, not during the Cultural Revolution or some really disruptive moment, a lot of them still look very fondly back at their homeland. They're living here for various reasons that they think is in their best interest. But on top of it, they have lots of friends, lots of family still there. So they're very careful about the way they talk publicly about the PRC. And then on top of it, many of them are still very supportive of the PRC. So you do have a lot of diversity in terms of the way the perspectives are among all Chinese Americans here. And then what drove me crazy, especially a few years ago when my book came out, was just this idea that I thought we needed to set a new course with Beijing and start to protect American interests, and how that got muddied into this idea of Asian hate, when just simply being tough on a government is nothing about anti-Chinese, number one. Number two is there's lots of different Chinese here in the United States and America and around the world. And on number three is Asian hate includes lots of nationalities and lots of different sovereign areas of the world that, quite frankly, see a lot more like us towards Beijing than they do in terms of applying their own perspectives to that of the same ilk that Beijing has. So it was just weird to get that all lumped in together in terms of Asia. So I'm glad people are starting to differentiate it. I believe the Select Committee has been very smart in terms of, hey, this has nothing about China to do with China or the Chinese people. This has to do with our differences of opinion on how to do things with how Beijing views things.
Well, we are running into a time constraint here, but there is a question I wanted to ask both of you. And that is, if you found yourself alone with both President Xi Jinping and then with President Biden, what is the one suggestion you might make to them to improve this relationship, get it off this the debt center it seems to be on now? Or do you think that in this presidential election year, no initiative really is going to make any difference? So let's start with you, Cal.
I think I would say in this election year, no initiative is going to make a difference. But if you look a little beyond that, I would say keep talking. I think it's great that they met on the borders in San Francisco. I think it's important to have that kind of frequent conversation between leaders, both at the very top, but also lower down, as we've continued to do. I think we need more of that. It's not a panacea, but it's much better to be having those conversations. And the last thing is, I would say, focus on what we can cooperate on. In particular, I would point to climate change as a shared issue for both societies. It's an existential threat in the long run for our prosperity, for our future, something that we can work together on as the two largest economies in the world, or two of the largest. So think about what we can cooperate on, because we're going to have conflict, that's clear. But we shouldn't view everything through the prism of conflict. There are areas of common ground, and we need to find them.
Yeah, I would probably add to that. I mean, those are all great thoughts. I would add to that also, instead of talking, listen and understand, right? understanding the perspective of both sides, right? Xi Jinping's, if I look at him in the most macro sense, he needs to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And part of his problem is he's got scarcity issues, whether it's water, food, commodities, energy, you name it. So he needs to spread his wings. There is a perception here that China wants to overtake the world. And I can't comment on whether that's something that he and the standing committee is looking to do. But what I can say is some of their spreading of the wings is to deal with those scarcity issues. And then I would say to Xi, he's got to look at Biden and realize, hey, he's got a lot of pressures bipartisan on him in terms of being tough on China. We have woken up to this idea that China is not necessarily always operating in the best interests of America and our allies. So he needs to realize we have national security at stake. We have principles and values that we hold dearly, just as much as the Chinese hold dearly in the PRC, that we want to protect. So how can he engage with us constructively? How can we reset the playing field in a way that allows him to deal with his scarcity issues, but also allow the United States of America to feel okay about the engagement that we determine is the best path forward, while not conflating all the other issues that are happening here in the United States that are pressuring Biden to essentially really push a hard line. So listen, understand, then talk.
As some wise person says, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen more than you talk. I want to end on a slightly optimistic note that for the first time next week, 3 senior flag officers from the People Liberation Army, one of them being the director of the UN peacekeeping forces at the United Nations, will meet in a public forum to open themselves up for questions and to make speeches. This has not happened before. Last year, we almost came close to this, but the Chinese pulled out at the very last moment. So I thought I'd tell you that, and our viewers that. And now let me, first of all, thank you, Dr. Raustiala, for hosting the Foreign Policy Association conference in Los Angeles. It was really, really effectively done. And the FPA owes you a debt of gratitude. And Chris, you're here representing the other participants. You were a key writer of the ultimate press, the final press release. And so I really wanted to thank you and Dr. Raustiala for being here today and making yourself open. And let me wish you both a good day.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
And now, as we end this program, I want to thank our viewers and say that thank you for listening. Keep coming back to Polaris-Live.com, where we have experts talk about bettering the U.S. China relationship and its impact on the wider world. And with that, for now, goodbye.